evening, everybody. Thanks for coming to this evening's UN Pathways Forum. We're going to be doing something a little different than what was originally scheduled. Unfortunately, the ambassador from Spain was recalled by his government this week for some, we think, interesting discussions about Brexit. We'll find out hopefully in a couple of weeks when we reschedule his visit. We are, however, extremely fortunate to have Ambassador Hamid Al-Bayati with us. Ambassador Al-Bayati is the former permanent representative for Iraq to the United Nations. He stepped down from that position in 2013, and since then has reignited his original career, which is that of being a professor. So before he went into diplomacy, he taught and did research, and now he teaches and does research again. And I'm very happy to say that he does teaching here at Fairleigh Dickinson, as well as at Rutgers and Fordham University. And he will soon be publishing a new book through Fairleigh Dickinson University Press. And the topic of our evening conversation is going to be the topic of his new book. For those of you who are new to UN Pathways, the way things run is I will have a conversation with our distinguished guest for 45 minutes, or if things seem to be going well, perhaps a little bit longer. And then we will open up the floor to questions for the ambassador about his work, both as a diplomat and as a researcher. Does that sound like an agreeable way to proceed?
Thank you very much.
Very good. So the topic, well, before we get to the book, could you tell us a little bit about your journey? I know it well, but those who are not fortunate to know you as well as I do, I think would be fascinated in how you started your career and the path that you took.
Well, thank you, Jason. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure and honor to be here among young students to talk about my book and also about my history. I was born in Iraq, and I finished my bachelor degree in Baghdad University. Then I was arrested by Saddam regime intelligence, just like any other young person who tried to raise his voice against dictatorship, brutality, and all kinds of oppression for the Iraqi people. Then I was threatened to be executed if I was arrested again. I was on the blacklist. So eventually, when the intelligence tried to arrest me, I left and I went to Cairo. I did my master's degree in Cairo University in Egypt. Then I had some issues with the authorities there because they were supporting Saddam regime at that time. So I left to the UK, where I did my PhD, and I started to join what we called Iraqi opposition in England. I was elected as a member of the Executive Council of INC, Iraqi National Congress, which was an umbrella organization for all Iraqi opposition groups and parties. In London, we launched a campaign, political and media campaign against Saddam regime. We worked with the members of British Parliament. We used to come to Washington, D.C. to meet U.S. officials, to New York to meet UN officials. And the peak of those meetings, when I was a member of six-member group invited to Washington, D.C. to meet Vice President Dick Cheney, Secretary of State Colin Powell, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, and almost every official in the administration during President George W. Bush time. That was in August 2002, 7 months before the fall of Saddam regime. And only the president who was in his ranch, it was August time, he was in his ranch in Texas. At that time, at that stage, they told us the president had taken the decision to remove Saddam regime. It's a matter of how and when. In our meetings, we try to give some advice to the administration, and maybe we can talk about this later because I don't want to talk much time. But one important issue, which we suggested that if the Americans are going to Iraq to remove Saddam regime, they should set up an Iraqi government immediately after Saddam regime fall. And they said, what do you mean immediately? We said, if you remove Saddam regime and there is no Iraqi government, Iraq will be under occupation. And occupation means resistance. And that resistance will be by some Iraqi people, but also some other organizations from abroad who will come to Iraq. And this is what happened. Unfortunately, American and the British decided to have occupation for 1 year, and that occupation made Iraq as a magnet for terrorists from all over the world, especially Al-Qaeda, which evolved later into ISIS. After the fall of Saddam regime, 1 month after the fall of Saddam regime, I went back to Iraq. I became Deputy Foreign Minister. I worked with British and American officials like Ambassador Paul Bremer, who was civil administrator of Iraq. During occupation time, I worked with military commanders, General McKernan, the first commander of US troops in Iraq, Generals Ricardo Sanchez, General David Casey, and the last one, General David Petraeus. Then in 2005, I had a brother who was kidnapped and killed by remnants of Saddam regime. During Saddam regime, I have 8 members of my family who were killed in 3 campaigns. The first campaign, 3 of them, a brother-in-law and 2 cousins. Second, a cousin and an uncle. And third, 3 members of my family who were accused of being in trade, and they manipulate food and they make high prices, so on and so forth. So after my brother was killed, who was the 9th member of the family, I left Iraq. I came to the UN as an ambassador from 2006 to 2013. And at the UN, I worked with 4 US ambassadors, 3 British ambassadors, 3 French, 3 Chinese, and only the Russian who have the whole time, Vitaly Cherkin, who served with me, arrived with me, but he died later while he was serving at the UN. So that gave me some kind of a good experience in politics and diplomacy, international relations. And I try to use this experience to teach students like you about the future, about what they could do, about politics, because I think we need a better world, and we cannot have a better world without better leaders, and young people are the leaders of our world in the future. So that's the journey, and then we can open question and answers, and then if you have any question, I can answer.
Well, let's talk about foreign policy. As a diplomat, you were largely charged to execute the foreign policy of your country. The question that I would ask is, in your experience, within a government, how is foreign policy actually made? What is the process for deciding how your relations should be in this region or in that region or with that leader or with this leader?
Well, that's a very important question, because we just see what the outcome of these decisions, but we don't know what's going behind the scenes, which is more important. There are different levels of decisions. So on ambassadorial level, there are certain decisions which I can take. So are certain decisions I have to go back to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. The Minister, of course, have deputies, because I was one of 3 deputy ministers when I was back in the ministry. And then some important and very major decision has to be on the level of the Prime Minister or the President. So certain things, as an ambassador, I could argue with my minister, and I managed in certain cases to change his mind or to change his decision. It's not easy, but you have to convince your boss sometimes that he's wrong, which is not easy, of course.
I do not recommend this for amateurs, but eventually you can try.
Yeah. So, but I'll give you a good example. United States encouraged Ukraine to go to the General Assembly, UN General Assembly, which is like the parliament of the world with 193 member states, to accuse the Soviet Union of killing 20 million Ukrainians by Stalin, George Stalin. And that means...
In what year was?
That was 1917, 20, something like that, early, beginning of the 20th century. But that means genocide, that means war crimes, that means crimes against humanity. For some reason, our ministry in Baghdad wrote to the ambassador of Ukraine, we're going to support that resolution. So I received the letter, and the Ukrainian ambassador came to me and said, there is a letter from Baghdad, from the ministry, which says you should support us. So, and what my impossible mission, that might remind you of Tom Cruise, of course, impossible mission was to take Iraq out of Chapter 7 and to lift sanctions against Iraq, which were imposed on Iraq back in 1990 when Saddam invaded Kuwait. And in order to take Iraq out of Chapter 7, which authorized the Security Council to impose sanctions and to use force, and when Saddam invaded Kuwait, Security Council authorized member states to liberate Kuwait by force, and the US set up a coalition of 30 countries. So in order to do that, I have to have a resolution from the Security Council. And the Security Council is like the government of the UN vis-a-vis the General Assembly, which is the parliament. And out of the 15 members, there are 5 permanent members who have the right of veto: US, UK, France, Russia, and China. Any of these countries can stop any resolution, veto it. So in order for me to achieve that big, impossible mission, I have to appease all the 5. Now, if I vote for Ukraine, Russia will be crazy. So the Russian ambassador, Vitaly Churkin, came to me, and he was doing that, and this is like a threat. Hamid, if Iraq vote for Ukraine, this is going to be serious consequences. So I picked the telephone off my minister, said, what are you doing? That's the hammer I have to hit his head with before I could do anything. He said, what? I said, you're expecting me to take Iraq out of Chapter 7 and to lift sanctions against Iraq and to vote for Ukraine against Russia, and Russia is a permanent member? He immediately said, what do you suggest we do? I didn't say what to do. I said, leave it to me. He said, do whatever you think right. He gave me the authority. Then I feel comfortable now. I can use my skills, my diplomatic maneuvers, I can say, to achieve what I have to achieve. So Russian ambassador came to me. I was a member of what they call General Committee. The General Committee decided any resolution should be passed to the vote in the General Assembly or to be rejected. And I was a member of that General Committee because I was elected as the chairman of, or a chairperson of the 3rd Committee, the first year at the UN, second year as a vice president of the General Assembly, third year as the chairperson of the 6th Committee. And the General Committees consist of the President of the General Assembly, his deputies, and the chairperson of the 6 major committees at the General Assembly. So the Russian ambassador came and said, what have you decided? I said, we will be neutral. We have pressure from US and from you, so we're not going to vote for Ukraine or we're not going to stand with you. He said, good. He was happy because we were supposed to be voting for Ukraine. Ukrainian ambassador came to me, what have you decided? I said, we're going to be neutral. We cannot vote for you. And he came with a trick. Can you send one of your deputies instead of you? He vote for us. I said, I'm the chairperson of the committee. If I send my deputy, it wouldn't work. Russian wouldn't buy it. Anyway, I end up solving the problem. But this is one example of changing a position of a minister. It was much harder when I tried to change the position of the prime minister. And about the same case, which is convincing 15 members out of the 5 permanent members out of the 15 members of the Security Council to lift sanctions. Prime Minister was in New York for the General Assembly, so I told him, we have an issue with these members. US and UK helped to remove Saddam regime. They expect to be rewarded for that. They spend money, they sacrifice lives, and so on and so forth. But the Russians, the Chinese, and the French also, the French were against the war, by the way, at that time, during Jacques Chirac time.
That was when we renamed French fries.
Yes. So, and they called it later freedom fries, something like that.
For a couple of years,
Yes,
French
yes.
fries
Yes.
became freedom fries in
Yes.
this country.
So I said, you have to do something. He said, Hamid, I'm not like Saddam. I can't say do this, do that, have a parliament. I said, Mr. Prime Minister, you want something, you have to give something. Oil is a political decision. It's in your hand. You are the Prime Minister of Iraq. You want me to achieve what you hope is the biggest objective at the UN, you have to do something. Anyway, he managed to do it. And the American and the British understand that we need that to the extent, I'm telling you something important. At that time, the US ambassador to the UN told our prime minister, or to the minister at that time, they are blackmailing you. What can you do? You have to go with it. So we end up, after 6.5 years, to have a resolution in December, on December 15, 2010, I arrived in April 2006. We managed to have a session which was chaired by Joseph Biden, the vice president at that time, to adopt a resolution to lift sanctions. So these are different level of decision. Of course, in the ministry, the minister will meet his advisors and his deputies. It depends what the case. If it's the case, for example, at the UN, then there is a special department would deal with international organization. If it's a bilateral relation, like with the United States, there is a special department for relation with the US, and so on and so forth. So different level of decision, but at the mission level, I have every morning meeting with my staff. We discuss everything at the UN, and then we go to the meetings. Every person, every diplomat will go to certain committee or commission or General Assembly or the Security Council, and then if there's something important, they will call them.
Let me try, well, first of all, thank you for that story. Let me try to draw some generalizations from it, and you tell me if I'm generalizing correctly. First thing a country needs to do is know what its priorities are. And if you are faced with a situation where you are, basically under sanction, you can't sell your oil, you can't import things your people need to live, happy, comfortable lives, that has got to rise pretty high to the level of priority. Second generalization that I would make is that foreign policy, although we might compartmentalize it, isn't completely separate from domestic policy, isn't it?
Correct.
Particularly when economic concerns are part of the foreign policy questions, and being under sanctions certainly was a huge economic and humanitarian struggle for the Iraqi people. And then the third generalization that I would make is that although what we would call realism, basing decisions on sort of pragmatic national self-interest, is part of how foreign policy is made. It's not necessarily in isolation from what you might call idealism. The idea that there are certain norms and principles, whether of justice or of fairness, that any country can, not necessarily, but can use to inform their foreign policy. So now the question, after I've made my little speech. Have you found that idealism always loses and realism always wins when there is a tension between the two? And I don't say conflict, because that draws things too starkly. But when there's a tension between an idealistic principle and the pragmatic realism of national self-interest.
Well, of course, idealism is that when you think how the world should be. And realism is that you have to accept what is happening. So it's sometimes you have to be realistic when you face a certain situation, and you accept. I'll give you an example. U.S. administration from time to time was calling for changing dictatorial regimes, just like what happened in Saddam regime. At that time, I remember vividly that some U.S. high-ranking officials said, we're going to go to Iraq, then to Syria, then to Iran, then to Saudi Arabia. We're going to change the regime. This is what they call the new Middle East. Well, it's not easy to go and remove every dictatorial regime in the world, or to remove any dictator who violates human rights. Idealists will say we have to fight every dictator in the world. But let me tell you something important. When we heard these statements from U.S. officials, we warned the United States.
And this was during
This was before Saddam.
the Bush administration,
Yes,
the second Bush administration.
Yes, George W. Bush. And I'll tell you something important. We told the American, you should say to the world that Saddam case is a special case. You're going to go to remove Saddam because Saddam committed war crimes. You know, he launched 2 wars in 10 years' time. He committed war crimes. He committed genocide, ethnic cleansing, and the crimes against humanity. Now, those types of crimes are punishable by international law. Now, yes, there are other dictators, but not every dictator invaded a neighboring country like Kuwait, annexed it, and delete from them. Not every dictator used chemical weapons against his people and against neighboring countries. Not every dictator commit ethnic cleansing by trying to wipe out the Kurds in northern Iraq. But by saying we're going to remove all the regimes in the region, you end up having everybody fighting you in Iraq in order not to be able to turn against them. And this is what's happened in Iraq. So I'm against any dictatorship, but I don't advise the United States to go and remove every dictator.
But there were such idealists in the George W. Bush administration who had a vision, and now I'll begin to refer to the title of your book, who envisioned a kind of new world order in which the United States and its allies could intervene in countries where the regime was not just abusive to its own people, but also threatening to others. They had you could call it a kind of a grand vision of a new world order in which dictator after dictator after dictator would be eliminated. However, when they made the case domestically within the U.S. for a war with Saddam's regime, made the case for invading Iraq with, countless trillions of dollars of effort, as it turned out to be, and a decade or more of military presence in Iraq. The case that was made, wasn't it more of national self-interest? The case that was made was, okay, there's this crazy guy, he's going to have nuclear weapons, he's going to have, weapons of mass destruction that can threaten, not just his immediate neighbors, but also the United States. Is it necessary, am I reading this wrong? Am I remembering that wrong?
You are correct, but the first president to use the New World Order was President H.W. Bush after the invasion of Kuwait. When he went to the Congress to talk to them about Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, and Saddam's invasion of Kuwait really was maybe a unique case of a country invading a neighboring country, annexing it and deleting it. And it was also a case that, according to the UN, this is some kind of course, aggression, kind of war crime, etc., etc. Now, at the UN, there are two important issues. One is sovereignty. And according to UN Charter, no country should interfere into internal affairs of another sovereign country, which means we shouldn't go and remove Saddam regime, for example, or we shouldn't go and interfere in any other country. This is internal affairs, and as long as a president is dealing with his own people, we can say anything. Now, there's another issue which developed recently, 2005, 2006, which is responsibility to protect, R2P they called it. The UN started to adopt a new doctrine or principle to say a dictator is not free to oppress his own people. Sovereignty is subject to a leader or a president who respects human rights. So the issue of a new world order, which was to remove dictators, again, as you mentioned, Jason, correctly, that in addition to what I said, that Saddam case was unique. The whole world knows that Saddam manufactured weapons of mass destruction, but he used them, and used them heavily against his people. In one incident, he killed more than 10,000 people in Halabja in northern Iraq and Kurdistan. President George W. Bush, after 9/11, his major worry that a rogue regime like Saddam regime and a terrorist group like Al-Qaeda, if they work together and they both consider U.S. as an enemy, the combination of a rogue regime and a rogue terrorist group could means an attack which is similar or worse than 9/11.
But the principle, if I may interrupt you for clarification,
Go ahead.
The principle was preventive.
Exactly.
Whereas under the first President Bush, there was a reaction to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait.
True.
And it was, okay, you have violated these norms of international relations, you have conquered your neighbor, we are now going to force you out and then reset the borders where they were before the transgression. In the second case, it was an argument to prevent such an occurrence in the future. And isn't that, well, I shouldn't say it, isn't that very different as a mode of foreign policy?
Yes. There are, if I quickly mention a couple of examples in which each case is different than the other one. Invasion of Kuwait, the whole world, the United Nations, the whole international community supported the US and the allies to remove Saddam from Kuwait because it was a clear violation to international law, to UN Charter, a war crime, etc. The same thing happened in Afghanistan after 9/11. The whole world supported the US. The UN gave a clear resolution. Congress gave authority to the president to go and topple Taliban regime, which hosted Al-Qaeda, responsible for 9/11. However, when it comes to Iraq, invasion of Iraq in 2003, although US and UK had all the evidence about Saddam regime, they couldn't get a green light from the UN. So in this case, it's completely different. But as you mentioned, Jason, it's very important to know that the military doctrine of US before and after 9/11 was completely different. So before 9/11, the US foreign policy vis-a-vis rogue regime and rogue terrorist organization will be what we call containment and deterrence. And even at some stage, they called it containment plus. And nobody knows what a plus means. They left it vague so they can...
I think drones.
Yes, like they can
drones.
fit anything in this plus. But it's containment. What is containment? However, after 9/11, the containment and deterrence policy changed to preemptive strike and war on terror. So war on terror was invading Afghanistan or removing the Taliban regime. Preemptive strike was to remove Saddam regime as a precaution measure against Saddam providing Al-Qaeda with chemical and biological weapons.
Yeah. I'm glad that you brought into play the concepts of containment and deterrence, because if you have the opportunity to study the history of U.S. foreign policy post-World War II, let's forget about the Monroe Doctrine for the time being, post-World War II, the policy was of deterrence and containment of the USSR, to prevent the Soviet Union from gaining strength in Asia, in the Pacific, in Africa, in the Middle East, and deterring the Soviet Union from taking aggressive, preemptive actions of their own. And that policy was consistent. From Harry Truman to Eisenhower to Kennedy to Johnson to Nixon to Carter into the Reagan and first Bush administrations. That approach to contain the enemy or the potential enemy and deter them from taking aggressive action, that was carried over into other sorts of conflicts, whether with non-state actors like terrorist organizations or state actors such as, well, Russia, to name just one, North Korea, to name another. The attack of a non-state actor, a terrorist organization, on the domestic territory of the United States on a massive scale, on an unprecedented scale, on an unthinkable scale, understandably caused some rethinking of that posture of containment and deterrence. However, and here I'll challenge you a little bit, because we're friends, and I can do that. I understand why Iraq was different and why Iraq needed to be different if the United States was going to invade and topple the regime. However, no one in the administration actually thought it was different, other than the possibility that there could be nuclear weapons under development secretly, clandestinely, and other large-scale biological and chemical weapons being developed secretly, and that these were already in the wrong hands of Saddam's regime and could easily fall into other hands. That was a big part of Secretary of State Collins Powell's case that he made before the United Nations. And it was a big part of the case that the Bush administration made domestically to gain the support of the American people for the war. And yet we know that Pakistan has dangerous nuclear weapons, and that Pakistan is a dangerous regime that doesn't respect the borders of its neighbors. We know that Pakistan has an unstable government structure, highly under the influence of radical Islamists. We know that Pakistan has harbored prominent members of Al-Qaeda, obviously, among others. But we don't say anything about Pakistan. We know that North Korea has committed atrocities to its own people that boggle the mind, that would be incomprehensible to anyone with any decent human sentiment. We know that they have developed nuclear weapons as well as the capacity to deliver them. Yet there's no plan afoot to take down the North Korean regime, as despicable as it is. So my challenge is, didn't we go after Iraq really, not because they were strong, but because they were weak? Because it was, relatively speaking, in their view, a 15-minute war. And then there would be roses and confetti thrown to the troops.
Well, the administration didn't feel that way. And I have to tell you something. I mean, this is through meetings with high-ranking officials, as I mentioned, Dick Cheney, Rumsfeld, Colin Powell, and almost every other official in the White House and the State Department and the Defense Department, except the president, who was not in Washington, D.C. Number one, they were sending thousands of plastic bags for bodies to bring soldiers back. Number two, the questions they ask us, especially Rumsfeld, Defense Secretary. Do you think if we go close to Baghdad, we will have fierce resistance by Saddam regime? Do you think Iraqi people will rise up? Do you think they will have weapons? so on and so forth. So they were really worried. So they didn't know that's going to be easy. We told them nobody will defend Saddam. They said, really? If that's the case, why they don't rise up against Saddam? And the answer was, they don't love Saddam, but they don't hate this money. Saddam buy people. So Saddam policy is to kill whoever opposes him and then to appease whoever stands with him. So what they would fight. But when it comes to American forces, they will run away. And this is what happened. The American British forces managed to remove Saddam regime in 3 weeks' time with 19 casualties, some of them through friendly fire. But I'll tell you this fascinating story. I was on the BBC Newsnight. At that time, we didn't have 24-hour news like CNN and ABC and CBS these days. It used to be news bulletin. So the last bulletin in BBC was Newsnight, 10:30. So I had an interview with BBC Newsnight. They asked me, British forces went to southern Iraq and Basra, and there was resistance. Why the Iraqi people didn't welcome British troops with flowers? I said, that's a good question. 1991, President George W. Bush said, there's another way to solve the problem of Saddam after Saddam invaded Kuwait. It's up to the Iraqi people and to the military to take matters in their hand, rise up, and remove Saddam.
And the policy was containment, again.
Exactly. So people rise up in Iraq, and they liberated 14 out of 18 states, provinces. The regime collapsed in 14, except the capital and 3 other states, one of them Saddam's birthplace, and 2 from his tribes. So the American went halfway, and then they let Saddam stay. Saddam crushed the uprising, and he killed 500,000 people. To my surprise, the next day, Tony Blair was in the parliament. They asked him the same question. You promised that our forces will be received by flowers. We see resistance in Basra. He said, Hamid Al-Bayati was on BBC 9. It was 10:30, so every politician will be able to watch only a news bulletin which is late. Otherwise, they are busy. And he said his speech, word to be repeated, was word to be repeated. In 1991, we went halfway. This time, I can assure the Iraqi people that we will not stop until we remove Saddam.
Let's move closer to the present day. After the Bush administration, there was the Obama administration. And what I will propose is that they wanted to do the opposite to the greatest extent possible. Where the Bush administration, in large part due to Colin Powell and Donald Rumsfeld, argued that overwhelming force should be used in any instance where American military lives might be in jeopardy, that you don't just go in with enough soldiers and munitions to do the job. You go in with 10 times the soldiers and munitions you need to do the job. You make sure that you get the job done as safely as possible for U.S. forces. And the second principle was something along the lines of, if you break it, you bought it. Mm-hmm. And there was a sense of responsibility, not just to succeed in the short-term objective of relieving Iraq of its regime, but a real sense that you need to stick with the aftermath of the mission. And I think your criticism of their plan for the post-war period was ill thought out. That doesn't change their commitment to that period. Their plan was flawed, but they were determined to stick with Iraq through whatever rebuilding process would be required. The Obama administration, it seems to me, and please correct me if you disagree, wanted to use as few forces as possible, as tactically as possible, and for as short a period of time as possible to achieve, granted, perhaps less grandiose objectives, but nonetheless objectives of national self-interest and wherever possible, support for people who are being gravely misruled. Am I right about that shift, or am I misreading it?
No, you are right. President Obama election campaign was based on bringing U.S. forces back from Iraq and Afghanistan. This is why, excuse me, by end of 2011, he brought American forces back from Iraq. He was planning to bring U.S. forces back from Afghanistan before the end of 2016, before the end of his second term. But he couldn't do that with Afghanistan. However, pulling the U.S. forces, all U.S. forces from Iraq in 2011, left a vacuum. And that vacuum, especially we didn't have Air Force, we were depending on Air Force, U.S. Air Force, especially surveillance and intelligence. That allowed ISIS, the terrorist group, which evolved from Al-Qaeda to Al-Qaeda in Iraq and then to ISIS, to take control of huge swaths of Iraq and Syria.
Including a great deal of the oil-producing.
Oil fields and, So U.S. Forces presence in Iraq was important for the security, not only for Iraq, but for the whole region. This is why now the decision to bring back abruptly the U.S. force from Syria is causing chaos in the whole region. Now the Turks are invading Syria, the Russians are taking the same bases with American left. For some reason, this causing a vacuum, although it's not a huge number of U.S. forces in Syria. So in general, I think talking about post-Iraq, post-Saddam Iraq also, that was a problem. We used to tell the American, let's plan for what will happen after. They said, we have plenty of time. They thought the war would take a long time. But when suddenly Saddam regime fall, there was chaos, there was turmoil, So I think in general, we need long-term strategy. There are tactics and strategy, and strategy always should be long-term. We have to have always plan A, plan B, just in case if something didn't work. Like the U.S. Army went to Iraq, and the U.S. Army did a great job of removing Saddam regime. But putting the U.S. Army to play a role of police in the street of the country, that would be impossible for poor soldiers who were trained to fight a war, and they fought a great war, but maintaining security on a daily basis is not their job. They were not trained as a policeman.
Now I'm going to get very provocative with you, and finally, I'll give you a chance to talk about your book.
Okay.
Okay. My next proposition is that the policy or the doctrine of using as little force as possible, as few soldiers as possible. And then there are other ways this revealed itself. I mentioned drones earlier today. The use of unmanned flying weapons to take out terrorist groups, to perform what we would normally call assassinations, but very tactical strikes in foreign territory. It really is sort of the hallmark of this approach of using as little force as possible and exposing as few American service people to danger as possible. The assassination or I don't know what term to use, of the leader of Al-Qaeda followed a very similar principle. A very small, select group of special forces went in to Pakistan to perform that mission. It was not 100,000 U.S. soldiers and dozens of planes taking Pakistan. My scandalous proposition is that the foreign policy doctrine of the current administration, the Trump administration, at least where this is concerned, limiting the exposure of American lives, limiting the presence of U.S. forces, using as little force as is necessary to achieve whatever the goal happens to be, that at least in this area, the Trump doctrine and the Obama doctrine, if you will, are remarkably similar.
Yes. I think the fact that President Trump believed that we shouldn't, or U.S. shouldn't fight wars in the Middle East. He was planning to meet Taliban organization to have peace in Afghanistan so he can withdraw U.S. forces from Afghanistan. And I have to tell you this, I was at a dinner with Secretary General, who was sitting, me and Zalmay Khalilzad, who was ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Iraq, Afghanistan, and then to the United Nations. He's now a special envoy to have negotiation with Taliban organization in Afghanistan. So we call him Zal for short. Zal, how much every soldier costs you in Afghanistan? He said, believe it or not, would be around 800,000
Per
a year per a soldier. I said, how many soldiers you have? He said, at the peak we had like maybe 100,000, say even 50,000. So imagine how much U.S. was spending in Afghanistan. I said, why don't you give half of this money for training of Afghan army? And Afghani is very well known of being a good fighter. Before the Soviet Union, they managed to defeat the Soviet Union forces. And then you leave instead of really risking the life of American soldiers. So Afghanis will be able to fight Afghanis easier and casualties will be less. Plus they know the terrain is very hard terrain in Afghanistan, mountainous country. Now, President Trump wants to withdraw U.S. forces from Afghanistan. He already decided to withdraw U.S. forces from Syria. So you are right about him. He opposed the war on Iraq, on Afghanistan, and on other areas. But the point is, it has to be planned in a way that you don't leave vacuum. I don't believe that American soldiers should be exposed to death anywhere in the world. It's the difficulty of the language, it's the difficulty of understanding the culture, it's the difficulty, everything. I mean, let me give you this good example. When I met Paul Bremer in Baghdad,
and Paul Brenner was
a civil administrator. He was appointed as a civil administrator and the head of the CPA, Coalition Provisional Authority.
Essentially an American official governing Iraq in the interim between Saddam and the new government of Iraq.
So one of his assistants followed me after the first meeting. He said, I want to meet you. She was a lady from the State Department. So we met. And she started to meet me regularly to talk. So one day, she wanted to come to my house. And she was late. She called me, said, I'm with the army because she can't leave the green zone, which is fortified area where the Americans are based. She cannot leave without military, being with her. She said, the military couldn't find your house, although we have GPS. So I said, if the military cannot find my house, how they can control Iraq?
This is a fair question and an amusing anecdote.
So believe it or not, she started to come herself driving her car, because I live across the river from the green zone without any military with her, against the regulation, because it was quicker and safer for her.
You couldn't just meet at a Starbucks, I take it, in those days. There was
No.
not.
Okay, well, believe it or not, I used to invite American officials and military officers to restaurants in Baghdad. The first few months of 2003, we used to go to a restaurant. Yes, we have some bodyguards, both from both American and Iraqi side, but we sit in public restaurants among the people, and we have a lunch or dinner. It was very, very safe. As I told you, Iraq became a magnet for tourists. When tourists pour from all over the world to Iraq, this becomes so dangerous that I'll tell you this story. When my brother was killed, I didn't go to his death ceremony or to his funeral because anybody could drive a car and blow everybody there. And later on, I received information that they were waiting for me to go to his funeral in order to kill me. So what I am saying is, yes, I am withdrawing U.S. forces who are unnecessarily in any country in the world. Put them in military bases nearby, no problem. But making them walking in the streets, that's dangerous. General McKernan was the commander of ground forces which invaded Iraq. I met him once. And he said, we have a problem. I said, what? He said, yesterday we have a patrol of soldiers walking the street, and somebody come and pull a gun and he shot two of them. I said, yes, of course, because American soldiers in the street, they don't know where they are going, who is who, they don't know the language. That's obvious. I told them a similar story. A friend of mine who owned a store, he said a patrol came into my store to buy something. One of the soldiers sits on the pavement outside. Somebody parked his car, crossed the street with the engine still running, walked by this soldier, shot him from behind, went and drove away, and they couldn't catch him. So it's really tough when American soldiers, and some of them for the first time they leave the country, go somewhere like Afghanistan and Iraq. Some of my students were military veterans, and they told me they served in Iraq, Afghanistan. They were doing a great job, actually. But you have to plan everything properly in advance before you withdraw these forces.
Okay. Now, finally, we'll get to the topic of the of the evening.
Okay.
I put it to you, and those of you who are Yankee fans, I assure you, you will not miss the first pitch, because I'm not going to miss the first pitch. What was I saying? Trump. So I think we can agree, broadly speaking, that the Obama doctrine and the Trump doctrine are similar with reference to tactics, with reference to minimizing the exposure of U.S. forces to danger, and also to using as few resources as possible to achieve a goal. From there, I think we need to talk about the difference in what the goals are and what the objectives are. And I think this is where we'll find that the Trump doctrine differs both from the Obama doctrine, the Bush doctrine, or even the Monroe doctrine. And can you speak to that question?
Okay,
finally?
Well, number one, I'm not Republican nor Democrat. I serve with, or work with officials from both parties. And I was giving them what I feel the right advice regarding, for example, when I represent Iraq, regarding the situation in Iraq or relation between Iraq and the United States. I have a full respect to whoever elected by this great nation. I think the United States is a great country, a great nation, and I decided to live in this country. I could live in any other country, but I think the United States is a great country, Iraq is a great country, and our relation could serve both countries and the humanity. The United States is the only superpower we have now in the world after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the importance of the United States, not only for its people, not only for its nation, but for every country in this world. Without the United States, we wouldn't be able to achieve so many things for the sake of the peace, stability, and prosperity of the world. So when I talk, when I say something, it's for the interest of the country, of the state, and the nation. People elected President Trump because they fed up with the establishment. Just like in Iraq, they fed up with almost every politician now. You can hear the news about demonstrations, ordinary people, civilians demonstrating against the government because there's lack of services. So they elected Trump because he's a successful businessman, and I live in Trump World Tower for 8 years, across the street from the UN.
It's a nice building.
Very nice building.
Good restaurant.
Everything is nice. Okay. You consider it as the jewel of the crown. And when Sandy storm took place, I have diplomats who had 3 weeks cut of electricity in their buildings. Nothing happened in his tower because it was built to take up to 3-level storm, and Sandy was only 2, level 2. Anyway, I used to come across him in the city, especially in Four Seasons restaurant. He loved it, and I love it. His daughter and his son-in-law used to come to receptions at the UN, and me and Jason have been to so many receptions. So President Trump, a completely different, outside the diplomatic corps or the political establishment. He has his own way of handling the situation. He still have his base, he still have good support among the American people. With that said, I have to mention that he departed from certain policies which were followed by both Republican and Democrats or Democratic presidents. And just few examples. None of the former presidents was ready to meet with North Korean President Kim Jong-un. We decided to meet him one-on-one against the advice of all his advisors, especially John Bolton, the former National Security Advisor with whom I work as ambassadors to the UN. He departed from one China policy when he started to contact or receive calls from the president of Taiwan. China was
not happy,
very upset, frustrated. He undermined the United Nations, European Union, the NATO, so many other international organizations. U.S. withdrew from UNESCO, Human Rights Council, climate change, and name it. He canceled NAFTA.
Well, not canceled, but
he renegotiated.
Renegotiated.
Yeah, but he ended up, no, he withdrew, but then he negotiated, and then he ended up having another agreement which is similar.
The Trans-Pacific free trade area.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think Trump opened more than one battlefront, more than a war at a time. Militarily, you better fight one enemy at a time. Like if the U.S. now, militarily, if the U.S. fight 2 wars at the same time, it's difficult to handle.
But this is a metaphor.
Yeah.
A metaphor.
Yeah. Anyway, so what I am saying is, if I was in a position to give an advice to President Trump, or by the way, a couple of days ago, we were with John Kerry, former Secretary of State, and from time to time, we meet some kind of former or present officials at the UN or somewhere else. And we talk, and we always, our responsibility is to give them the right advice. So the right advice would be, you cannot fight the whole world. You cannot undermine your allies. Yes, you have differences, normal, but you cannot undermine them, you know. We have, for example, issues with Canada, with the Prime Minister there. We have problem with French, with the British, with German. This is not the right way. You are a superpower. You are the only superpower. You have to be like the big, the important, the old person, the family who look at everybody in the same way, take care of everybody. Otherwise, the credibility of the United States will be in jeopardy.
And I think if the Trump administration would respond to that, it would be something like, well, so what?
Okay.
And with this proviso, that what Americans really want is don't want their brothers, sons, sisters, daughters to be killed in some far-off country, and we want prosperity at home. So following a doctrine of pursuing economic self-interest for the United States, keeping us out of foreign entanglements that will endanger both lives and wealth of the nation, if you will. By doing so, he's giving Americans exactly what they really want from a foreign policy, and that to persuade the Trump administration to adopt different policies, you would need to persuade the American people that they should want something other than keeping their sons and daughters, brothers and sisters safe, and promoting the economic prosperity of the United States in isolation from other countries in the world.
I agree.
And now you have an opportunity to make that case, not whispering in the ear of the prince, as Machiavelli would have it, but talking to the citizens of a democratic country whose government, you know, one way or the other, is going to follow its lead.
Well, I agree. Economy is the priority for American people. And sometimes I say foreign policy in the U.S. is domestic policy. So, and presidents who do well with economy, sometimes they have more popularity, they are elected, vis-a-vis those who cannot do well with economy. So, of course, prosperity, and this is a major issue, especially for young people like you today. I feel sorry for students who sometimes have a burden of paying the loans when they graduate, actually, you know. So, in general, jobs and it's important. Employment is so important. But we have also to bear in mind that what we spend on American forces abroad is huge money which we can invest inside the country. As I said, in Afghanistan. If you calculate how much the U.S. forces spend in Afghanistan, if they give this part of this to training a local army, that would be safer for the American and better for the country. That's the same thing could happen in Iraq and in any other country in the world.
But coming back to it, you did a very clever diplomatic maneuver.
Diplomat.
I know. The hardest thing for any leader to do is criticize the people, right?
Well,
you very seldom find a political leader who will say, you know, all you guys, you are wrong. You should think differently. You should be different. We've had occasional leaders that have done that, but they were perhaps not as successful as those who felt the pulse of the people, or at least vast numbers of the people, and gave the people what they wanted. And it seems to me that the Trump doctrine, such as it is, seeks to give the majority of the American people what they want from a foreign policy, fewer foreign entanglements, less exposure of American troops to danger, more wealth and prosperity and jobs in this country. And those of us, and I think we're of similar dispositions, those of us who aspire to more from the United States, you said the U.S. is the last superpower. Well, not for long if it disengages so thoroughly from the world. Talk us into not doing that. That's really what I would look to your new book to pose to us. It's easy to criticize decisions that are popular. How do we change the minds of Americans to assume a different way of looking at the world and their responsibilities in it?
Well, from my experience with American, when it comes to certain countries, and as I said, I work with them when I was in England, when I went back to Iraq, when I was at the UN. There are certain things which is clear. Like if you travel to a country and you don't know somebody there, you might worry. But if you know somebody there could tell you where to go, what to do, it's become much more comfortable. So when you decide to send forces to Iraq, it's very important to understand that country, to educate the soldiers about that country. I lived in London, and the British police teach courses to every summer that tourists who come to this country, they come from different culture, to make them aware of that culture. So if you go to a country like Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria or any other country in the world, you need to be sensitive to the culture, to the tradition of that country, number one. Number two, listen to the people of that country who could understand it more. Like we could help the American in Iraq, Afghani could help American in Afghanistan, so on and so forth. So that's very important. I mean, they depend on Iraqis as translators, English, Arabic translate, and Afghanistan on Afghani people. So without the people of the country, and by the way, in both countries, they were welcomed. American troops were welcomed by the people. Later on, because of the problems which happened, people start to feel that the presence of American forces is a burden on the country. So those issues, I think, should be always considered. But United States, for the foreseeable future, is going to be the only superpower, and the whole world will look to the United States. And the United States has to play a leading role, because if they don't play that role, somebody will jump in. And by the way, when President Trump criticized the UN, and he decided to cut the budget contribution to the UN, Secretary General Guterres said there are other countries who will jump in. And he was mentioning, no, he was not mentioning a country, but there was a country in his mind, which is China. China's always jump in whenever the American leave. And now in Syria, we can see that the Russian jump in as soon as American left.
So I will distill your advice into 2 points, okay, and then we will open up to questions from the audience. First, ignorance is the greatest danger. Whether it's ignorance of culture, ignorance of language, ignorance of geography, ignorance of motivation, ignorance of values. Ignorance is perhaps the greatest danger that can face a country or society. And the second point that I distill from what you've said is that you need to have a long-term view, not a short-term view, not this quarter's economic news or this quarter's jobs report or this quarter's, or God forbid, tonight's media cycle.
Can I add one point, if you don't mind?
As long as you don't mention Twitter.
No.
Okay.
My personal experience that unfortunately American administrations is always trying to reverse the previous administration decisions.
Which obviously had to be wrong.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's
And it was.
so that's one. Second, I always say when you have soldiers in any country in the world, the administration should be behind their soldiers, regardless. I mean, if a president takes a decision to send soldiers to a country, even if that decision was wrong, for the next president to say they shouldn't be there in the first place. This happened in front of me, like a president who said, oh, we shouldn't have been in Iraq while soldiers were in Iraq. And my reaction to the US ambassador at the UN, you should tell your president, because she asked us our view about his speech. I said, you should tell your president he should stand beside or behind his soldiers in Iraq. You shouldn't say they shouldn't be there in the first place while they are there. They are doing a holy mission. They are doing a noble mission by defending human rights or bringing democracy, elections, women's rights to Iraq. But to say they shouldn't be there in the first place while they are there, will undermine and affect their morale and their duty. So not because a previous president sent them, you should say no, they shouldn't be there while they are there, because that's, so being united is so important as an administration, as a nation, and the whole world is looking to you as American people. And I remember vividly when I was in the elementary school, we read a story that a man who was dying, he had 4 children, he asked them to bring some pencils, asked each one of them to bring a pencil, and they managed to break it, and they asked them to put the 4 together, and they couldn't. So a great nation, a great country with a leading role should continue that course and not change course. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And let's have some questions. Ashley, are you going to do the honors? Please raise your hand and we'll recognize you. I think we've left them flabbergasted.
That means our speech was very clear.
It means that they're completely and 100% convinced. Shocking, but true. Yes, thank you. And if you could identify yourself and then ask your question.
Hello, I'm Jessica Bergoni. I'm obviously a student here, I'm a junior. I just wanted to know what, in your opinion, do you think your biggest accomplishment was in your career? Personally to you.
Other than teaching at FDU. So the second most.
Yeah, in North Korea. Huh? Okay. President Trump believed that by sitting with Kim Jong-un, he could convince him to disarm. And I'll be very frank with you. The person who ruined that chance, or maybe play a role in ruining that chance, was the former National Security Advisor, John Bolton. John Bolton said North Korea should disarm just like Libya. And what happened in Libya, that after Gaddafi gave up his program of producing mass production, the weapons of mass destruction like chemical, biological, and the nuclear project, he was toppled and killed. So immediately, North Korean reaction was that we're not going to disarm. So President Trump said there will be another meeting. Hopefully they will manage. The difference is as follows, that US want a complete cancellation of the nuclear program. North Korea is ready to do little by little until trust be built and until they see what could be the future. So I think in negotiation, flexibility is important.
And that's the most important lesson that you've learned in your career. But can you point that in the direction of your greatest diplomatic accomplishment? Would you say it is the relief of the sanctions on Iraq?
The biggest achievement, yes.
And that was the method that you used?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Does.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Please come back in a couple of weeks when we will be here again with another UN Pathways Forum. There's information up front. And please join me in thanking Ambassador Al-Bayati for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you.